All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining in. This first story that I'll be reading is called The Home Thing. The Home Thing. The problem was that Mani had gotten used to a world where Iran was the home thing and America was everywhere else. The place he was part of as soon as he walked out his door, even though the boys he played with when he walked out the door were Mexican and Chinese. So when Mrs. Pardo had said that studying history in fifth grade was going to include learning about everybody's personal histories, it had been too much for him to think of having Iran out in the open like that in the classroom, like everybody would be looking inside his house. And so on the day that Mrs. Pardo was going to teach them about Iran, he woke up with a headache and a stomachache. He told his mother that he couldn't go to school. He liked the idea of them learning about Iran as long as he wasn't there. He even saw himself coming to school a little proudly after they did. His mother looked at him and said he didn't have a fever and he wasn't sneezing. Did those older boys take your ball again? She said. No. Then you have to go to school, his mother said. She didn't understand, nobody understood, and his mother and father didn't care because nobody was going to talk about Iran at the hair salon or at his father's office. And even if they did, his mother and father didn't act different when Americans asked them about Iran. They just listened and smiled and acted like it was very natural to have a home thing and everywhere else. And Monty felt bad when he thought it, because sometimes it was very natural to have a home thing and everywhere else. Like when they were playing in the street and Carlos's grandfather or Dustin's mother came out and yelled in Spanish or Chinese for them to come inside. That felt good to hear. On the school bus, he tried not to think about it. Maybe it would just be very general. Maybe she would just say that the capital of Iran is Tehran. That would be all right. That was the kind of thing that anybody could find in a book. Maybe she would just stick to facts. Every place had a lot of facts. That would be okay. He wouldn't feel so much like they were seeing inside him then. But when he got to school, he felt even worse because he saw his classmates and they all looked like they'd woken up in the morning with so many other things on their mind. And what if they thought that learning about Iran just got in the way of those things? What if they didn't like it? What if Nelson tried to pass a note while Mrs. Pardo was turned around? What if Jessica rolled her eyes? He didn't know what was worse, the feeling that they would all be looking inside his house, or the feeling that they would be doing that and still be bored. He had never felt so nervous at school before. He didn't know if he could make it up the stairs. He wondered if he should just go to the front desk and tell Mrs. Cantor that he was sick. She would probably be annoyed that he was sick before the school day had even begun. He looked at all the American kids going up the stairs and he couldn't imagine how this was something they never had to worry about. They never had to worry about a home thing that was different from school and everywhere else. And it almost seemed ridiculous to him because how would you ever have anything that was secret if your home life was the same as your school life? But it didn't help to think it was ridiculous because he knew the American kids all thought it was perfectly natural for those two to be the same. And he felt bad about it, but he wished that Mrs. Pardo would just stick to Christopher Columbus and how many original colonies there had been, because he was fine with all that stuff. He was fine with learning that stuff at school and learning about Iran at home when he listened to his mother and father talking with the rest of his family. And, and anyway, they talked about Iran in Farsi, which was the way you were supposed to do it. And it brought a whole new wave of nervousness over him to think of Iran being talked about in English, because that was the school language. And he just didn't know what would happen if the school language and the home thing got mixed up together like that. And in some distant part of himself, he felt how he'd actually worked to build the wall between home things and school things, because it just made everything clearer that way. And even though it gave him a thrill to think of not having that wall, there was something that overwhelmed the thrill, which was that he hadn't had the realization that it was work until just now. He slowly walked to his classroom, and Mrs. Pardo saw the way he tiredly put his books down on his desk. Monty, she said, what's wrong? Nothing. The American kids in his class were talking and laughing and remembering each other the way they always did in the mornings, the way he usually joined in with them to do, but he didn't feel like doing it today. He looked at the board and saw that social studies was at its usual time, right after first recess. He didn't think he'd be able to play basketball or soccer or anything at recess today. He didn't think about it in the morning when they had math, but at the end of math, it all came back to him again. Only now it felt even worse, because he'd had a chance to see just how American his school life was. He couldn't imagine how the kids in his class could go from the way they'd been talking in the morning to something as distant as his home thing. It was too much to ask of them, he thought. Mrs. Pardo saw his face look the way it had when he'd first come in, and she asked him to stay in when the class went out to recess. Money, she said, are you worried about social studies today? Yes. Tell me what you're worried about. Everybody is still learning about America, he said. Maybe they'll think it's too much to have to learn about Iran, too. Mrs. Pardo, whose first name was Jean, had been a teacher for 6 years. When she listened to Money, she remembered graduate school and a professor she'd had named Ann Ruthstein. She remembered her saying how children from immigrant families can have all sorts of reactions to having their stories integrated into the curriculum. Even parents from immigrant families could have all sorts of reactions to that. Ann Ruthstein had said that some immigrant parents even thought it was putting their children behind to learn about their home countries, and they should be learning about America as much as possible. Jean Pardo had felt brokenhearted to hear that. She remembered how she'd gone home and told her boyfriend about that, and he hadn't shown much reaction to it one way or another. And that had been the first thing that had gotten her thinking about their eventual breakup. Well, she said, social studies is about learning about the world. America and Iran are both part of the world. Mani nodded. He knew that America and Iran were both part of the world, but it just made everything easier if America could be the school thing and Iran could be the home thing. And he felt sad and angry that he didn't know why. What do you think would help you feel more comfortable? Mrs. Pardo said. I want to listen, Mani said, but I don't want anybody to see me. Do you want to put your chair outside the room? Mrs. Pardo said. I'll leave the door open. Mani nodded. Okay, Mrs. Pardo said. Mani felt better. He went outside to the schoolyard, and when a ball rolled over to him from the basketball court, he picked it up and took a shot that almost went in. After recess, Mani took his chair and sat outside the classroom. Mrs. Pardo propped the door halfway open. She wondered how it would look if Mr. Willits, the principal, walked by, but she felt like she had a good explanation. She told the class that Mani needed a little space. Mrs. Pardo showed the class where Iran was on the map. Mani looked through the doorway and felt very excited. There it was, all right. How about that? His whole class was looking at it. He almost couldn't believe it. Mrs. Pardo talked about how it used to be Persia, and she showed pictures of the ruins. Mani had never seen them before. He felt just as proud of them as if he had known about them for a long time. Inside the classroom, Nelson raised his hand and asked to go to the bathroom. He saw Mani in the hallway. Hi, Mani, he said. Hi. We're learning about Iran. I know. Were you born there? Yes. Have you seen those statues? No. Do you want to play pickle after lunch? Sure. After talking with Nelson, Mani moved his chair closer to the doorway. He looked inside. They were all listening. Jessica didn't look like she was going to roll her eyes. Mrs. Pardo was talking about Iran like it was somewhere close, not far away. Mani wondered how she knew that it was close. It was very close. It was even closer than he had realized. Are you in trouble, Mani? He turned around and saw Angela Ruby coming out of Mr. Harkness's room next door. No, he said. What are you doing out here? I just felt like being outside for a while. Mrs. Pardo lets you do that? Sometimes. Mr. Harkness would never let us do that. Nelson came back from the bathroom just then. Kids in your class can sit outside the classroom? Angela Ruby asked Nelson. Only on the days that Mrs. Pardo is teaching about where you were born. I was born in Sacramento, Angela Ruby said. I was born here at Children's Hospital, Nelson said. Mani looked at them. I guess everybody was born somewhere, Nelson said. He went inside the classroom and Angela Ruby went to get a book from her bag. Mani looked in and saw that Mrs. Pardo was showing pictures of the Haft scene. It sure was nice. He couldn't imagine how it must be for the kids whose home thing was always the same as the school thing. Life must be wonderful. They had this every day. But somehow he thought that if they had this every day, they wouldn't really be seeing inside him as much as he thought. He hadn't been seeing inside them on all the other days, or if he had, it hadn't been in a rude way. Everybody's inside and outside were a lot closer than he had thought, and they were mixed up together. He had been seeing their inside by way of their outside. If anybody wanted to do that with him, that would be all right. Maybe he could have his inside and outside be mixed up together too. He moved his chair right to the edge of the classroom. Mrs. Pardo began to read The Little Black Fish. It was a book his parents had at home. At home, his father was teaching him to read in Farsi, but Mani couldn't read it yet. Mrs. Pardo had an English version. As the little black fish was deciding to set out to discover the end of the river, Mani picked up his chair and went back to his desk and sat down. Mrs. Pardo didn't look up or pause or anything, and he knew that she wouldn't look up or pause or anything. She knew that he knew it, and that was a kind of love. Everybody saw him come in and sit down, but that was all right. They ought to know that he was nervous, because his home thing was special and important. His home thing happened to also be a world thing, but he didn't know how. He didn't remember because it had just been a long time, because it had just been a home thing for a long time. But he felt how it was bigger than that, because it had a place in school. And he had always been told that school was the most important place for him to be concerned about. What all of them had, his mother and father and sister and himself, was a place in his school. He didn't know if they knew that. He felt very excited to go home and tell them. The end. All right. So the second story is a little bit shorter. I'll just do it like this. All right. Second story is called Good Try. Good try. The games were on Friday evenings. Last year they had played on Sundays, and that had been better because on the weekend, Will Penny remembered that he was more than a kindergarten teacher. He remembered that there was a roughness and hardness in the life of men, and he could step on the field assured in that memory. But on Fridays, he had to go straight from the school, and even though he would try to leave who he had been all week behind, he couldn't help it. When somebody on his team struck out or made an error, he would say, "Good try." The men on his team were not men who dealt in good try. It hit them wrong. They were bartenders and chefs and mechanics and one magazine writer who was an especially cynical one. They wanted to tell Will to shut up when he said good try, but they knew that he was coming from childhood. What was it that made a man no longer want to hear good try once he had seen a certain aspect of life? The men on the team could not remember a time when they would have been glad to be told good try. If they had been, they were better off not remembering that time. They had made some kind of peace with the way that good tries didn't have much to do with life. It had to do with a secret belief, perhaps even secret from themselves, that all of childhood had been a good try, but where did it get you? They could take some comfort in the way they all knew that together. But when Will would tell them good try, their collective grip on that knowledge would be shaky. Will knew it himself. He knew that he should leave good try at the school and in the playground where he watched over games of handball and steal the bacon. But it was very hard. The grass at the field was like the grass at the school, and the sky in the evening was like the sky in the afternoon. So it felt like other things might be the same too. When he said good try, it was because it really looked to him like a good try. It looked like a good try in the game, and it looked like a good try in life. Why can't a man be who he is among children, among men? Will Penny didn't know. He was saying good try to children with the understanding that the boys among them at least would grow up to be men. Good try had saved many kids from crying or getting upset when they got out or lost the game. He could understand if the men did not like that implication, but it still did not seem like a bad thing to say. He was only trying to build up the people around him, same as he had been doing all day. Sometimes Will's voice rang out over the field, and the players on the other team would notice the way he was trying to build up the people around him. The men on his team drank beer in many of the same bars as the other players in the league, and they learned that their reputation around town had become that of the good try team. That did it. The men decided they had to have a talk with Will. They couldn't stomach the thought that people were beginning to see them and think of a good try. Nobody wanted to say anything before the next game, though. They wanted to tell him that good try had no place on a baseball field when the people doing the playing were men, but it was hard to present substantive evidence as to why. They didn't want him to start saying bad try. They realized that what they were advocating was his silence, which made them wonder what was so important about silence among men. And they knew what it was. It was the sense that in his silence, a man was going to the same place inside himself that was inside his fellow man. But it felt like it would break the whole thing open to verbalize it in a way that would be irreparable. So they stayed silent because as long as there was silence, there was a sense that that was the place they all went together. Will's voice became even more prominent as the men became silent, and the opposing players wondered why only one guy on their team was doing all the talking. There was something that made the men feel powerless in the face of good try. There was a part of them that wondered if they had been told good try enough as boys. They could hear the building intention in Will's voice. It was a strange feeling to be believed in like that. They wondered about the children who heard it every day from Will. They thought that maybe they became the confident men and women they saw sometimes in the city. Of course, the other possibility was that they expected to hear good try their whole lives and they never learned to stand on their own 2 feet. The men preferred to take this position towards it. The first time someone finally said good try to Will was in the 6th game of the season. It was Derek Willoughby. The men gave him an incriminating look. Good try, Sean Gilligan said. Yes. He's been talking to kids. What's your excuse? It was a good try. Sean Gilligan spat disgustedly at a tree. He hadn't known that in his mind he'd given Will Penny an excuse for saying good try. What were they going to do, start saying good try left and right now? A man had to be on top of something. He couldn't always be climbing it. He had to be sitting on top of it sometimes, looking down. That was the thing about good try, the men thought in their silence. When would you ever stop saying it once you started? Good try, world. Good try, life. Good try, everybody, everywhere. There was no boundary to it. Will Penny felt the same way on Friday afternoons. He felt there was no boundary to the way a man could build up a child's sense of who they were by seeing their effort, by letting them know their effort was a seen thing. The school grounds certainly did not seem like a boundary, not when everything else about life seemed the same. He laughed when Sean Gilligan turned back to the game after Derek Willoughby said good try and called out to him, good try, Will. You almost ran it out, but no milk and cookies for us. We have to go have nap time, and then we can wake up and have show and tell. He laughed because he could hear how Sean Gilligan didn't mean it, or that he didn't know what he meant, or that the silence that men went into instead of saying good try was a reasonable place to go, all things considered, which it was. Will Penny knew that it was because he knew how much he needed a place to go to each day where he could say good try as part of his own trying. He knew how important it was for men to have silence as the second best option. It was just that the games were on Fridays and he couldn't help it. Okay, he called out to Sean Gilligan, but please raise your hand next time, or you'll have to sit in the timeout chair. Everybody burst out laughing. Sean Gilligan laughed too. Okay, Will thought, I just hope you know that I got this laughter from kids. They made a kind of uneasy peace with being known as the good try team that season. The next season, the schedule put them back on Sundays, and Will would have had a couple of days then for his week with kids to wear off him. And he would have his own silences to go into during the games, his own moments of wondering about who he was, blending with thoughts of the game, blending with the necessary compromises with dreams and the gentle sadness of Sundays. At least for the first few games of the season, he would miss the way the men would throw a quick glance in his direction after getting out, looking to see if he would say the words that gave a beat they could fill in with the musicality of their own lives. Yes. All right. And this last one is a short one, and it is called The Calendar. The Calendar. My father kept his heroes alive for me as long as he could. He told me later that he hadn't meant to do it, but that the way I'd listened had made him do it. He told me about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Che Guevara. They were alive in his stories. I was very little and I hadn't started elementary school yet. All I knew was what he told me and how happy he was when he spoke about them. I couldn't wait till I was older and could be as happy about them as he was. I started kindergarten when I was 5. At the beginning of each month, our teacher, Miss Meyer, would have one student come to the front of the class and mark the important dates on the calendar as she read them. In January, it was my turn. She gave me a sticker and announced that January 20th was Martin Luther King Day. Before I even put the sticker on, I said, "Is he coming to our school?" "No, Nina," Miss Meyer said, "he isn't alive anymore." I stood with the sticker that didn't do anything. I looked at the class. Nobody was surprised that he wasn't alive anymore. People died, but I didn't know Martin Luther King had died. When I came home that afternoon, I kept waiting for my father to come home from work. I was going to be mad at him. Miss Meyer had used the nice voice she used to kids in our class who didn't know something they should know. I'd heard her use it to other kids, but I'd never heard her use it to me. It felt good to be mad at my father. He had told me a story, but he hadn't told me the whole story. I didn't know why he had done that. I didn't like the thought that he only wanted me to hear the part of the story that was alive. When my father came home, I didn't hug him like I usually did. "Martin Luther King is dead," I said. "Nina," my mother said. "Yes," my father said. He looked very sad. He is. It was hard to be mad at my father when he looked so sad, but I had been waiting for a long time. "Miss Meyer told me," I said. "Nina, that's not the way to say hello to your father," my mother said. My father took a deep breath and went and sat down. He put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right. He's dead. I'm sorry." He stayed sitting there with his head in his hands longer than I could stay mad at him, and longer than my mother could stay mad at me for not running and saying hello to him and hugging him the way I usually did. The end. All right. Thanks very much.